Okay, hello everybody. This is Dr. Marston, and we are now starting in the sixth week, and this is the video lecture for the sixth week. And as it says in the syllabus, what we're going to do this week is start moving into objective testing with a particular focus on the MMPI 2. I'm going to start tonight by talking a little bit about objective testing and its its contrast to projective testing. So we'll talk tonight a little bit about objective test and start talk. I'm going to spend a good deal tonight just introducing you to the MMPI 2. Some of this will be stuff that's already in the book, but I really want you to have a good um, sense of what this test is. Okay, so we are now moving into uh, uh, objective testing, sometimes called subjective. Um, and so uh, let's start talking about the different types of personality tests. And really, I think it's important to talk about really when we get into um, uh, the difference between objective and projective tests. We really are talking about the concept of personality tests as opposed to diagnostic tests. There really aren't any projective diagnostic tests, and projective diagnostic tests are ones that are kind of limited to one purpose. Their only purpose is to help identify if a person has a certain condition: depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, ADHD. And it says something as we move out of projective tests. It probably says something, and I don't know that I've really talked about that. There are no real single use projective tests. There are no projective tests whose only purpose is to identify one specific condition. In contrast, there are a lot of objective tests that do that. The Beck Depression Inventory, the Beck Anxiety Inventory, the Hamilton Depression Scale, the ADHD rating scale, the autism rating scale, the autism diagnostic observation schedule. Um, it's very interesting, by the way, just again to move on. One group of tests that we will not talk about here in detail as far as a specific type of psychological tests are neuropsychological tests. Um, and they are a whole other group. And what's interesting about neuropsychological tests is sometimes the tasks that are involved in a neuropsychological test can look a lot like projective uh, uh, psychological tests. Um, there is a test called the Bender Gestalt where you are asked to just copy designs. And then there's the house tree person where you're asked to draw specific things, house tree person. One is a neuropsychological test and one is a projective personality test. The difference being that there's a specific outcome that's expected on the neuropsychological test. Basically, with the neuropsychological test, you are um, basically with a neuropsychological test, you are asked to complete a task and there is an expected outcome that people who do not have neurological impairment would show. So if your response doesn't have that outcome, pretty much the interpretation is that something is going wrong neurologically, and uh, the sort of the focus is on trying to decide what that is and how to and how bad the impairment is or the neurological deficit is. With a projective personality test, um, uh, the interpretation is more open ended. There isn't such. Basically, I think one way to say this is with a neuropsychological test, there really is a quote unquote wrong answer. You know, if you're asked to draw a clock, um, and you draw, you know, you're expected to draw a circle with one hand bigger than the other hand, a very effective neuropsychological task for Alzheimer's disease is asking the person to draw a clock, where they are asked to, and to make the clock say 10 minutes after 11. So you draw a clock, you write the numbers 12 through 12, and then you would be expected to have a big hand pointing at the 2 and a little hand pointing at 11. And there is a quote unquote wrong answer to that. In fact, it's not even quote unquote. There is a wrong answer to it. You know, if you draw the hands the same length, or you draw a clock that's square, that is considered to be the wrong answer. With a projective personality test, there isn't necessarily a wrong answer. There are different interpretations of the answer you give. By the way, if you are wondering why we don't talk about neuropsychological tests in here, I was just asked next semester to teach a class on neuropsychology. So the reason we don't talk, even though this is a testing course, the reason we don't talk about neuropsychological tests is that's considered to be a category unto itself that's covered in a course separately on neuropsychology, which I think is coming up. It's supposed to be coming up. Uh, so so here we really talk about we're really talking about personality tests. There is no such thing as a projective diagnostic test, a projective test whose only purpose is to figure out if the person does or does not have one condition. But we are now getting into objective tests, and there are such things as diagnostic objective tests, and we may talk about that as we go on. But the MMPI-2 and the TAT, the two main tests that we talk about here, are personality tests. And their purpose is to observe and describe the structure and content of personality. And that includes the characteristic ways that a person thinks, feels, behaves, and interacts with other people. It is meant to clarify such things as diagnoses, problematic patterns of behavior, intra and interpersonal dynamics, and treatment implications. Now, notice that the things that a personality test will address can include diagnoses. It's just not the sole purpose of any projective tests, but it's part of it. Same with objective tests. There are no objective personality tests that are just for diagnoses, but diagnoses can be part of what the test tries to identify. Um, when you have an objective personality test, there are specific questions or statements to which the person responds by using specific fixed answers or a rating scale. By the way, the most common rating scale that you will hear me mention here for a lot of psychological tests is called the Likert, Likerd scale. And that's typically something that's rated on 0 to 5, a 0 to 5 scale. It could be different, but it's, you've seen these. It's 0 to 5. 0 means, if for instance, if you're testing for um, anxiety and you want to rate how often the person has different symptoms of anxiety, you may do it on a 5 point Likert scale. 0 means that problem never occurs. 5 means it occurs all the time. And then it could be the score they give would be on either one of those or somewhere in the middle. And then there are scores that are tabulated and compared to reference groups. And usually those reference groups are split up by, the most common way to split the reference groups is by age. But then it could be, you could also have racially separated reference groups. You could also have a reference group separated by education level, that sort of thing. But there are specific scores that are tabulated and compared to reference groups. And the scores, the reference group scores that are used are called norms. And the collection of data that is used to develop norms is called normative data. And the idea is that you give the test to someone, they get a score on the scales of the personality test. And then what you will do is compare that score to the reference group. So, for instance, and there could be many different reference groups. With the MMPI, there are many different reference groups um, that are related to different diagnostic categories. So, there's a reference groups of individuals who have depression, uh, individuals who have schizophrenia, that sort of thing. And what you are meaning to do with your score is find out um, what um, what reference group they best fit in. The person you're doing a test on, which reference group they best um, the person best fits into, what their scores are most similar to when it comes to the other reference group. Or if your normative data is on age, it basically lets you see where your participant is compared to people in their same age group. So your normative data would show where you expect that person to be, and then the you would then take your participant score and see where they fit as far as the age group goes. So normative data can be used one of two ways. One is to see how your participant, the participant you're testing, compares to other people in their same group, whether it's age group, racial group, whatever. Or it could be that you use the normative data to see whether your participant, the person you are testing, your client, um, has scores that are similar to individuals with certain who are in certain diagnostic categories. So you may be looking for how your client did on the depression scale with other individuals in their age group who had depression. And if it looks like they're pretty similar, then that would be an indication that the person you're testing also has clinical depression. Some examples of different objective personality tests. We're talking about the main one here, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Some other ones are called another one is called the Milan Multi-Axle Inventory, and it's on its third edition. The Milan Multi-Axle AXIAL Inventory, third edition. So, and the initials are MCMI 3. The MCMI is very similar to the MMPI. It is designed to be more um, directly related to DSM-5 categories. The MMPI scales, after they were developed, were a lot of research was done to see what sort of results on the scales are most consistent with different DSM diagnoses. The MCMI was developed specifically to coincide with the DSM diagnoses. Another objective personality test is called the 16 personality factors. And another one is called the NEO personality inventory. NEO personality inventory. Okay. We're going to talk about the MMPI too. Let's start by talking a little bit about the MMPI. And as I said, I want you to have read this in the book, but I thought I'd go through some of the basics. It was developed in the late 1930s. That's when they started developing it. And it was published in 1942. The original authors, as you can see in the book, are Stark Hathaway and J.C. McKinley. Started off with 1,100 items, and by the time it was first published, it was cut down to 566. And it was used for routine diagnostic assessments. Now, notice from the date there, in case you may not be aware of this, but one of the reasons, I was talking about the MCMI and how it was developed to coincide with the DSM. And actually, one of the reasons that the MCMI was developed is because at the time, the MMPI, which was the most common personality test and still is, but at that time, it was also the most common personality test. And the MMPI wasn't developed to relate to the DSM, even though by the time the MCMI had been developed, the DSM was by far the primary diagnostic system. But the MMPI hadn't been developed based on the DSM because, like I said, you may or may not be aware of this. 1942 was about 25 years before the DSM came out. So you had, just a little history with the MCMI, you had this period of time after the 1960s, and the MCMI was in the 80s. By the 80s, you had this sort of discrepancy in that the most widely used personality test, which at that time was the MMPI, was not directly related in any way to the most commonly used diagnostic system, the DSM. And the authors of the MCMI saw that as not being quite a good thing. Now you could make the argument that it was a good thing, that it's good that the two are separate, because then if you've got data from one that does coincide with the other, that supports your conclusions, because they aren't necessarily always in sync. So if they are, that gives you a little bit more strength for the interpretation that you're making in terms of diagnoses. But the decision was made at the time to develop a personality test that more directly coincided with the primary diagnostic system. And that's why you have the MCMI. One other reason that the MCMI has become popular, not as popular as the MMPI, but certainly up there, is because it's much shorter than the MMPI. Okay, so the MMPI was published in 1942. It was used for diagnostic assessments. So it was, even though it wasn't developed, well, it was developed with specific diagnoses in mind, just not the DSM diagnosis, because the DSM wasn't going to be around for another 25 years. It was based on psychiatric population in Minnesota and 724 individuals who were not who did not have a psychiatric diagnosis. Interesting thing, the 724 Minnesota normals were individuals who were, in quote unquote normals, people who didn't have a diagnostic classification and were used as the control group in the development of the MMPI. Those 724 individuals were visitors to the hospital. Now, that, of course, brings up a lot of questions about, you know, why were they in the hospital? If they were visiting the patient, were they family members? If they were family members, isn't it possible they had something as well? Couldn't there have been something genetic? There was an attempt to screen for that, but for the most part, they were basically 724 people who were visiting the hospital for various reasons and were willing to take the test. Um, the you'll see the list in the book of the scales, and just to keep in mind, the MF scale and the SI scale, basically called the masculine femininity scale and the social isolation scale, those were not the original clinical scales. There were 8 clinical scales. So right now there are 10 clinical scales on the MMPI-2. There were 10 scales on the um, version of the MMPI that was used um, for decades. But originally, when it was published, there were only 8 clinical scales and the 3 validity scales. And the MF scale and the SI scale were both added later. And then um, in 1989, so that test is around. Basically, that test was just around, thousands of studies used in many different settings. Really not a whole lot of controversy about it as a diagnostic test. Where a lot of controversy came up about the MMPI um, was when it was used like in an employment settings. Um, Same as had been in the um, same as had been in the projective personality test. I think I may have mentioned this in the first class, but it's interesting to just keep in mind when we talk about with the MMPI. If you ever see the original movie Miracle on 34th Street, which is about Kris Kringle, Santa Claus, um, there's a scene where Kris Kringle, who everybody knows is Chris, who they think there's something wrong with him because he believes he's Santa Claus, um, goes into the human what would now be called the human resources director, and is given a psychological test. There's a psychologist who works for the store, and you see the psychologist giving him a bunch of cards. Well, that clearly was the Rorschach. Um, that was a use of a personality test that was considered quite controversial later on. The idea of giving someone a personality test as a condition of them staying employed. Um, Same with the MMPI. The MMPI was used and continues to be used in a lot of different settings for employment, but that's actually been kind of controversial. Um, um, where it has remained as a standard would be for occupations where the presence of some sort of psychological disorder would really represent a public safety hazard. As I've mentioned to you before, and we'll bring up again, usually when you interpret the MMPI, when I do it, I will give the MMPI, and then what I will do is I will send it to a testing company, and they will send me up back results, and they will send me um, some interpretations based on the research. Um, you are able to order tests for specific purposes. Like if I'm using the MMPI, which I have in a prison setting, I can get I can send the results to be scored and interpreted, and I can request that they give me the specific prison um, results, and they'll test it against normative data that was conducted on people in prison, and interpretations based on those norms. Why I'm bringing this up is there are also ones for specific occupations. I can do one for one I know specifically you can get is for police officers. If someone is trying to get a job as a police officer, they may very well be required to get a psychological assessment. And if, as part of that assessment, they're given the MMPI 2, the evaluator can send for the test to be scored and interpreted and can request the specific interpretations for police officers. I know you can also get it with for pastors, church leaders, um, and those are just some examples. So, um, I bring it up because that was the one controversial area uh, in um, in the use of the MMPI. But what did become more and more not controversial, just more and more evident was that some of the wording didn't really fit. And uh, I don't have any examples right now. I think there may be some in the book, um, but there were words that didn't um, quite fit. Use of language. There was sexist language in there, and so there was a decision made to revamp the whole MMPI, to redo the wording of every item, um, and to replace some that just didn't make sense anymore. And that led to the development of the MMPI 2. That came out in 1989. Just to tell you and you know that's in there, James Butcher, John Graham, Joseph Ben Poreth, Aki Telegan, and W. Grant Dahlstrom were the authors of the MMPI 2. And the MMPI 2 is based on uh, one thing that changed with the MMPI from the MMPI to the MMPI 2 is the MMPI 2 actually had the MMPI 2 and the MMPI A. So the MMPI, the original MMPI, there was not a separate version for adolescents. There is a separate version for adolescents now. There is the MMPI-A, which is for individuals from age 12 to 18. With the MMPI-2, 567 true false items, the items rated true or false. That was the same method for the MMPI. It was true false statements. Um, the normative sample, the sort of comparison group, the group of individuals who had no um, uh, psychiatric diagnoses, were 2,600 residents of the U.S., 1,130 male and 400. I'm sorry, 1,138 males and 1,462 females. Their ages were from 18 to 90, and it was split. Uh, the age split within the normative sample was based on the census at the time. And then what you do is you come up with an individual, you give the person the test, and um, their clinical profile is compared to the normative sample. So you determine how close their results fit with this normative sample, the individuals who had no diagnoses, and then you see how close it fits with specific other individuals with specific other diagnostic categories. Um, Most widely used psychometric test in the world. It is used in mental health, medical, and like I said, employment settings, although employment is sometimes controversial. Um, uh, Thousands upon thousands of research studies involving the MMPI 2. Uh, Pearson Corporation is who puts it out. There are different versions of um, of how you can give it. There's a computer version. There's a audio version for people who are blind. Paper and pencil, so you can take it on paper and pencil. You can do it on audio recording. You can use a computer. You can also use uh, what is called a box form, and this is interesting. This is an interesting one. Each item um, is on a separate card, and then what the person does is they would just take the card and put it in either the true or false category, true or false box. That's for people who have visual problems, not blind, but have visual problems, or just get easily overwhelmed by too much information. I mean, if you, I don't have it in front of me to show you, but you may remember when I showed it to you first time. There are 500 plus questions. Uh, each page of the MMPI2 has like 30 items on it. So if you get easily overwhelmed by a lot of stuff coming at you, so someone with schizophrenia may have problems with it, with completing it, just because there's so much stimuli as far as the test goes all at one time. You have to be a licensed psychologist uh, with a graduate course in tests and measures. So if you ever want to buy the MMPI 2, when you have your degree, you will need to show that you had this test. One of the reasons why we have this course is because if you ever want to buy something like the MMPI 2, you will need to show that you had this course. Um, I've got some information here that, I mean, it's just uh, when you give it to the person, you want to be in a quiet room, good lighting, not a whole lot of instructions. The instructions are written on the MMPI 2, and they're basically a paragraph. Typically takes 60 to 90 minutes. I have that on there. Probably closer to 90. I probably could count on one hand the number of people I remember getting it closer to 60. I tell everybody who's taking it that they should expect to be there for at least 2 hours. Um, this is interesting. The person taking it has to have at least a sixth grade reading level um, for the MMPI 2, not the MMPIA. But the MMPI 2, you have to have at least a sixth grade reading level. Okay. With the MMPI 2, there are the 10 clinical scales, and then there are three validity scales. And the validity scales are meant to determine whether the person's response pattern was one suggested of their not being totally straightforward and open with their responses. And some of the factors that can influence how a person does on those scales, and some of the factors that those validity scales are designed to identify, include the person just faking, just lying straightforward, just lying. Um, Second could be social desirability, that they are looking to present themselves in a way that you, as the examiner, will find uh, positive. Okay, continuing on with the factors that can influence on the validity of the results. Um, Item omission. Um, if the person just leaves out items, they skip over items. There's a scale. It's not one of the three major validity scales, but there is a scale specifically for number of missed items. And if you miss too many, depending on the age group, it can determine that the scale is invalid. Problems of interpretation. The person just didn't understand the items. Um, my standard approach for helping with interpretation is typically when I give the MMPI-2, I will leave the person alone in a room. I will either go to my other office, which is next door to the office where they're taking the test, or I will go into the waiting room if no one's there. And I will just sit and I will do other things, but I will be available to them if there's a problem. And what I tell them is every half hour, maybe every 20 minutes, depending on how much difficulty I think they might have, um, I will I will come in and I will say to them, "Did you have any questions?" And they are allowed to ask me, "What does this item mean?" or "What does this specific item mean?" But I will tell them at the beginning that my answer to that question, my first response to that question will always be, "What do you think it means?" Because what I want them to try to do is answer the question based on their interpretation of what the item means. So it's basically my saying that the answer to the question, what does this mean, is it means whatever you think it means. I find that helpful. And to be honest, ever since I started doing that years ago, I rarely have anybody um, skip over items because they can't figure out what the item means. Um, Self-deception, that's a good one. I mean, a good one in that that's one you don't often think of, that people can deceive themselves. You know, their response may be invalid because they're basically lying to themselves about what problems they do or don't have. Lack of insight can be another one. Okay, so um, there are 10, mainly there are 10 clinical scales and 3 validity scales, and then there are a bunch of other subscales and things like that. Um, the 3 main validity scales are the lie scale, the infrequency scale, and the correction scale. L is the lie scale, F is the infrequency scale, and K is the correction scale. Other scales con- considered to be uh, part of the validity scales, although they're not the main one, is there's one that's just marked with a question mark. In fact, on the scoring item, it says question mark, and that's the cannot say. Those are the ones that are ones that are uh, that's the section for the ones that weren't filled out. Some other scale, you can read all about the validity scales in there, but another one that's just kind of or two that are just kind of interesting. One is called the FB, F small b, and that is considered the backside in frequency, and that's kind of an interesting one. What that is the F scale, the validity scale called the F scale, is basically for items that are not marked frequently, so they're unusual answers. And again, it's the same with every other scale. You know, if you get 1 or 2 infrequent items, it doesn't register at all. But if you get a whole bunch of them, that calls into question some possible problems. But what's interesting about the FB scale is it's the backside infrequency. So it's whether the questions start to get more, whether more of these infrequent items are apparent in the latter half of the test. Basically, it's a way of testing um, whether um, whether or not the person maybe starts to slip off during the latter half of the test. So the FB scale is an interesting one because it is a measure of whether things start to get more bizarre in terms of the person's responses towards the end of the test. If maybe after taking this test for, you know, if it takes you 2 hours to complete, if after the first hour maybe they start to just slip off somewhere. Um, By the way, another interesting one for the validity scale, just because it's interesting to keep in mind that it exists, is something called an infrequency psychopathology. It's the FP scale. And that is the scale that takes into account these items that are marked infrequent and identify which of those infrequent items are ones that typically relate to psychopathology. Because one of the difficulties with the infrequency scale um, being high is it's hard to interpret because these are items that are marked where the responses are bizarre or unusual. Well, you don't know if you're getting that because um, the person may have a severe psychological disorder. People with schizophrenia tend to give bizarre responses. Or if the person may be giving bizarre responses because they're trying to look weird, or they just aren't paying attention what they're doing, or they're trying to give the most bizarre answers just to make themselves stand out or just to cause problems. So you've got this infrequency scale, and then you've got this FP scale, which is infrequency due to psychopathology, the degree to which the infrequency scale score is consistent with someone having severe psychopathology. And then another one is true response inconsistency. It's called the TRIN scale, true response inconsistency. And that's one that that's a measure of whether the person may just be answering true to questions just at random. You're just marking true or marking true to everything. Um, just to give you a little bit more detail about what these validity scales um, mean. Hold on one second there. Um, the lies. So let me go through these validity, and then I think we'll stop here. The lie scale is used to assess whether the test taker approached the instrument with a defensive mindset. So if the person was being defensive, if they were trying to look like they didn't have problems, um, um, that's what we go. So lie scale is sort of it's unfortunately named. It's not actually lying. It's the person being defensive or trying to create a favorable impression um, and look better than they actually are. The F scale, the infrequent, this is detects atypical responses, atypical, unusual responses. Um, it could be indicative of somebody who is faking bad, trying to. So the lie is trying to look better than they're actually doing. The F, the infrequency scale, could be someone who is trying to look worse than they actually are. Um, and then the K, the correction scale, is meant to assess an individual's level of defensiveness in responding. So that could be someone trying to fake good, but it could also be defensiveness. The K scale is interesting because the L scale, which is faking good, is conscious. The person is one interpretation, not always, but one interpretation of the lie scale. Excuse me, the lie scale is the person is faking good on purpose. They are consciously trying to look better than they are. The K scale is subconscious or unconscious defenses. It's defensiveness in the psychodynamic um, definition, which is the person has serious psychological difficulties, but they are not aware of it. They are not even admitting it. They're not admitting it to you because they're not admitting it to themselves. So those are the three validity scales. Like I said, I think this is a good place to stop, and we'll pick this up on Thursday.